Bonjour.
Hello.
On m'entend correctement.
So everybody can take place. Thank you for being with us here this afternoon for a session, interactive one, which we're looking particularly forward to, because not long ago when you talked about Africa, it was a coup, institutional crisis, political crises. Today we still hear about that, of course, but more and more we're hearing positive things when we're talking about Africa. We're hearing growth, investment and new technologies. So indeed, we are going to be talking this afternoon about, for 60 minutes, around a theme which is digital Africa, Africa in the digital era, even if we're used to saying that the new technologies are not the solution to all the issues that Africa has to face up to, but the fact is that we're seeing these new technologies today. We're seeing an acceleration of development, at any rate in some countries, some regions of the continent. We often hear about technological leaps, and we're going to be talking about this vast question, of course, but with concrete examples through the three speakers that we have here today, our three guests. Ammin Youssouf, who's the co-founder of Afrobytes. Hélène Zemmour, who's the director of the digital division for TV5. And Ulrico Grech-Cumbo, who's going to introduce himself because he's an English speaker, and he's going to be explaining what he does with an application called meilleur. I'll present myself, I'll introduce myself. I'm Julia Ben Mohamed, I'm a journalist at Doura Ben Mohamed. I've been working in Africa for 10 years now, and 5 years ago I created Africa News Agency, a press agency specialized in the African economy, with the view of changing how Africa is perceived. So we'll talk first away with, we'll start with Ammin, because I love Ammin. I'll say that immediately, because he's created with William Mohamed, they've created Afrobytes, which is a platform which not only provides visibility for the tech players in Africa, but does much more than that, goes well beyond that. And we'll start with the first question. When you talk about Africa, digital Africa, when you talk about Africa 3.0, Africa who's entered the numerical digital era, is that a fantasy or is it a reality? Well, first and foremost, as we were saying previously, before we took the microphones, the title of this session is Africa boarding the digital world. But let's start the other way around. It's a digital world going into Africa, because the final frontier of the internet, the final frontier of investment, after that it's Antarctica, so we're penultimate in Africa. So there's a major movement today. Marc Gutenberg, who was with us last year. There's Jack Matt, who was in Kigali in 2017, and you had Dolph Fisheim, who was in Lagos in 2017. So they're really working on this continent, which is knowing a demographic growth which is huge, where the potential is huge. So I'll be short, but I'll draw a quick comparative, a simple one. 15 years ago, if people said there's going to be technology in Africa, everybody would have laughed at you. But today, the valorizations in Chinese investments are higher than US investments. So the investments in China tech are going to be huge. And WeChat didn't exist 5 years back, but it's 54 countries, 55 countries maybe, Africa, and things are going to happen. I can't say what's going to be happening 2 years down the line. We can look at trends, but something is going to happen. Big things are going to happen, and I would say for the people who missed the emergence of the Asian countries, missed the emergence of blockchain, you really need to be on board now with what's happening in Africa and what's about to happen. So what we see today is what is visible when you travel throughout the continent. You can see more and more that the media, when we meet people in Paris, it becomes clear that more and more people are focusing on what's happening in Africa and the African production. There's more and more applications coming out of Africa. Today we have We have Made in Africa with regard to video games. We have a team of young people from Cameroon who've created the first, it's been presented as the first video game which is 100% African, but not only in terms of the graphism, but the graphics, but also the history of its story. It's really adapted to the African public, and that's a trend today. Recently, there was a first edition of the Forum of Games, of Pan-African Games, which happened in Abidjan in November 2017. It's Sidik Batayoko who's created a virtual venue of video games. It's a young person who's fascinated by video games, passionate about them, who realized that there was a market there and that there were investors who may be interested. And if I may, it's called Treja in Abidjan. There were 50,000 young people who were playing e-sport. E-sport is really exploding. There's a huge boom. It's a sector which is really exploding. And I would also like to add, if we're talking about games, I would like to add, of course, you need African content, absolutely. We have cœur and Kukulu game. So maybe so that people can follow, there's a third edition of the 7th and 8th of June. There's a third edition of this event, and there's an Ethiopian lady who's designed a game on mobiles that you play on mobiles. It's a pony running through a village, and who doesn't want to be caught. But what's the most interesting? It's something else beyond that. The interesting part of that startup is that they've noted that you cannot do in-app purchases for applications in Africa because you don't have a bank account often, because you don't have a credit card. So what they're doing, and this is huge, they're currently replacing that by purchasing airtime. That is to say, you buy it with the time you speak on the phone. So what if they manage to do that? It's fantastic because people who are not interested in Africa, people finally they manage to find their way to play, to create content, and they create alternative models. If it functions, if you start to say you don't need a banking account or a banking card, a credit card to do in-app purchases of games, so you can imagine this is something which is fantastic. So it's very interesting to look at what's happening in the emerging countries, generally speaking, in Africa specifically, because there are models of rupture, of disruptive technology which are appearing, which are very interesting to observe and to monitor, indeed, including in the virtual space. So we have Grech-Cumbo with us, who evolves in the virtual world with a game called ZVR, which is an experiment for virtual relaxation. So can you tell us a bit more about that, and maybe give us a bit of an idea of your perspective on Africa? What is Africa for you? Is it a market? Is it an experimental field? Is it a game?
Well, just to give a bit of a background on DeepVR, so we're a content studio based in Johannesburg, South Africa, and we started in 2014 specifically with a focus on telling stories in virtual reality. And so we've got a commercial wing of the company that does advertising-related work, and we've got an original content division that does various different things, including stock content for meditation purposes, but we're very interested in narrative. We're very interested in wildlife. We've got amazing wildlife in South Africa. We've got incredible access to wildlife, and so our original content division focuses on using VR as a tool for conservation. So we create these stories in the natural world, and we use these stories to engender empathy and align them with conservation causes.
Very good. And today the ecosystem, because naturally we have, and we've said that with Ammin, today there is more and more creativity in Africa. We have young people launching applications which are absolutely very dynamic, but the ecosystem today in Africa, is it favorable for the emergence of products, of new products, of digital products?
I think we're finally there. I think it's a very realistic commercial reality that there's an entire economy behind digital products. And to Amin's point, you know, Africans are finding a way around the barriers that have historically held, you know, African content creators and African tech entrepreneurs back. We're seeing some really amazing things in South Africa. We do benefit from a relatively good infrastructure in South Africa compared to many other African countries. But, you know, we're seeing countries like Kenya and Rwanda producing incredible stuff that is really technologically up there with the best in the world. You know, from our own perspective, one of the things when we go around and meet people from around the world, we often present our work to people and they watch it and they take off a headset and they say, how have we not heard of you before? Which is an awesome compliment and also a little bit of an insult, I guess, in a way, because we're on the bottom of the world and, you know, we're not playing on this global platform quite yet, but the quality of the work, I think, is there. And I think that's representative of many, many people in tech in Africa.
Hélène,
you also, TV5 Monde, for a long time you've made the choice of digital, you've gone down that route, so you'll demonstrate that to us. And I would have a question to put to you, because we're seeing with, in particular with the liberalization of the audiovisual industry in African countries, there are more and more televised products on the web also who are adapting to the new expectations of the public, of the emergence of middle classes. That's something that we hear a lot of talk about, and there are more and more products which are adapted to the new expectations, and is that the African reality? Yes, the new usages are there. They exist in Africa. So the African continent, it's an average age of 16, 17. So it's a young population, and it consumes a lot of web, of internet produce. It's very connected. There's been a generational leap. So people connect on smartphones, Android in particular, on the African continent. So there are new usages which exist, and we need to respond to them. And us as TV5 Monde, which is a cultural French-speaking channel, an international one, it's absolutely a major stake for us, because the French-speaking countries, that's where there's the most French-speaking countries out of every continent. So there's something which is really huge for us, a major stake. We need to be able to really speak to these new targets, to these new people who knew TV5 as an older TV channel which has been on the continent for 25 years. For 25 years we've been present there, and the Africans, they tell us, oh well, that's our parents, so that's the channel that our parents watch, but it's the only Pan-African channel, so the African diaspora also knows TV5 very well. So we needed to say and to ask ourselves the question, how can we connect with the young people, with the youth of Africa, to the programs, to the French-speaking programs that exist, to the content that we want to offer to them. So we had the idea of developing at the end of last year a digital offer, 100% digital offer. We have an internet site and an application. I can show you this one here, maybe it's appearing on the screen now. So just to show you in a few words how this project came about. So it's on internet. So we really wanted to focus on mobiles, on smartphones, because the Africans, they often have several smartphones, so they consume data in a different manner according to the connection they have, with a reasonable connection, and they have connections when they have access to Wi-Fi. So often they often download when they have Wi-Fi access, and then they watch the programs later on. The application is totally free. We thought that was essential, that everything be free. So it really reflects the diversity of the channel of TV5 Monde. It's news, programs, exclusive products, series, fiction. It's works function. Parents mode d'emploi, for instance. That's the Gabonese version of what we have in France. It's very funny. We have many African series which are functioning very well, which are working very well. So we're present throughout the African continent, but also the African diaspora, people who love Africa throughout the world. So we really wanted to work on an offer which would be adapted to the usages with an offline mode. So that is to say, even when you're not connected, you can consume programs, they can be downloaded. So upstream, that meant that we needed to negotiate with the producers. There was a whole negotiation with regard to rights, which is very specific, because you have to authorize downloading onto smartphones, onto the hardware. So that was not the easy easiest of projects with regard to how some producers approach that. And you also have the channel which can be watched live on the African continent. So a short video
pour vous présenter donc cette offre numérique Afrique
to show you this application which we launched in Rwanda at the end of 2017 and then in Abidjan, and then it was rolled out throughout Africa.
Découvrez la nouvelle offre numérique.
So discover the new digital offer. 100% mobile, 100% Africa.
Retrouvez gratuitement.
So you can find for free all the information, all the news on Africa.
Le journal Afrique.
The news program Africa and all the articles from its journalists.
Retrouvez.
So you can also find your private, your favorite programs on the application TV5 Afrique.
On s'amuse bien, on découvre de belles choses.
So good! Oh! So good! Yes, on peut le faire. Yes, we can. Mais pourquoi tu me regardes avec ton nez? Ça va! Va!
Avec ou sans connexion.
With or without connection, you wherever you want, when you want.
TV5 Monde Afrique.
TV5 Monde Afrique.
Continent.
It's a whole continent in your pocket.
Voilà, donc ça vous donne un
So that gives you an idea, an overview, a rapid overview of what we've done digitally speaking. It's to really go and speak to this youth, which is very connected, and offer a la carte programs that they can consume when they want and wherever they may be. So we need to work with all the producers in Africa to develop contents which are pure web content. In order to really have these short formats, and we have products which are written for the social networks with African producers, African directors. So we're working very closely with we've been working very closely with Africa for 25 years, and we're looking forward to the next 25 years and beyond. So a question that I'd like to put to all three of you before I open up the debate to questions. So I work in economics. We like figures, but here are some figures which are very interesting. Today we estimate that we have 60 million consumers who use internet on the continent. That seems very little since, but it's really the very beginning. So 2025, we should have the half of the population of Africa should be connected. And bearing in mind that in 2050, the population of the continent will have doubled between now and then. So all that opens up new perspectives, new possibilities in every sector, not just in the digital world. You were talking about a rush of investment onto the African continent, so today our theme is digital, the digital world. So the question is for everyone, what are the perspectives looking ahead that digital opens for the years to come? So it's true that first the figures, it comes from the group of telephone operators, of internet operators, and they have growth rates which are always very big, and then it goes even beyond their estimates every time. So these figures are probably under the reality. So there is something which is quite mathematic in Africa. Mathematically speaking, people who are aware of Africa, who know Africa, know that the population is going to really grow exponentially. I'll give one example with regard to needs. If I talk about education, I'll take that as an example. Education, we're the youngest continent. So there are so many children being born that it is absolutely impossible, technically impossible, I'll tell you that now, arithmetically, to build schools at the rate at which children are being born. You can't do it. It's impossible. Even if you wouldn't even have enough people to build them, even if you had the means, the budgets. So schools, there's a whole infrastructure around it. So the schools, such as it is seen now, as it has always been for the past 150 years, with the teacher standing up in front of 30 desks with children, that won't happen. It can't. We need to respond to what's happening. So we need to invent something completely different, a real shift with regard to education, and that's where we're going to be looking for e-learning, and we're going to be looking for chatbots, artificial intelligence also, because we don't have a choice. Simply put, it's not even a question of, oh, I want to go down the digital route. I don't have a choice. If you're in Africa, if you want to educate those children, at one stage I'll give you, and you know, I could give examples like that. I could roll them out in every sector, but I'll give a reason, a basic reason. You have a farmer, for instance, a farmer who has money, who lives, but he's say lower middle class. He lives in a village, and to send his children to school, he has to put them on a bus. They have to go to the town, which may be 60, 80 kilometers away. They have to stay for a week on their own. So there's no more. It can be dangerous. They're away from their family. It's expensive, and also those children, a bit like in France, before they won't be able to work on the farm whilst they're away. So now you say to that person, to that father, you say your children are going to continue going to school, but it won't be with an actual teacher standing ahead of them, in front of them. What I offer, I can give you this. I propose that you have a smartphone, and they can go and look at documentaries on rhinoceros in South Africa, for instance. They'll say yes, of course, because the cost is much more interesting than to have to send the children away 60 kilometers, 80 kilometers away. And economically speaking, it's totally rational. There's no emotion involved. It's just business at the scale of each individual. You say, well, how can I allocate the little money that I have in an efficient manner, bearing in mind that I absolutely want my children to be educated? So I'm offered an alternative, and I'll take that which makes economic sense. So we have the figures, and I believe that it's going to be much faster than we generally think nowadays, because the value of this usage of those technologies is huge, it's massive. Here you still have the choice, you can switch a TV on, you have a TV not far from you, just on your road, but over there you don't have the choice, there's no alternative. That's why we were talking about Rwanda, because we created the first drone pop, and that there were no physical bank that existed there. So it's a problem which brought about an innovation which spread like wildfire. So if you want to continue and say further, so we're looking forward to a bright future at that level. Yes, absolutely. I quite agree with what he says, because we're developing apprenticeship of French on the web, which is absolutely free, by offering different types of apprenticeship of learning French for foreigners from the contents which we have both on our traditional TV and on the web, and that is it's actually the biggest classroom. It's already online. Young people who want to learn French, they can use the TV programs, they can use internet. That's something that they use every day, and that's where things are happening. And we realize that there's a huge demand. The teachers too. The teachers, they need resources, they need web resources, they need new tools to capture the imagination of children, for them to learn. And they want to get their lessons to evolve, so technology will be everywhere, and the applications and the autonomous apprenticeship and new ways of teaching are appearing, and there's still a lot that can be done, that needs to be invented, but we're part of that development. And I think that, as Ammin was saying, Africa, it's a fantastic playground for us media, of course, but for many other sectors, many other stakeholders of public life.
Yeah, I think there's been a perception historically that poverty and living in rural areas means no access to technology, and in some thanks to China, the lower cost of development of certain technology, we're seeing smartphones now being available for $50 to $100, and the predictions are that by 2020 over 60% of Africa will have access to smartphones. That's super exciting to us as VR content creators, but because the smartphone is VR capable. So I was chatting to Ammin about it beforehand, but you're going from a device in your hand to a device inside a cost-effective Google Cardboard headset, and you can teleport people to different places around the world, like TV Sank has been doing with exploring Paris, for example. So the advent of the smartphone, because of the much lower cost, is a super exciting thing for Africa and a huge opportunity for content creators.
Ulrico, Ammin disait tout à l'heure.
And Ammin was also saying previously that the world is going towards a digital world, in bringing the digital world in Africa. Is it possible for a product today made in Africa, whether it be an application, a video game, or even a smartphone which is designed in Africa, let's take that as an example, to go onto the global market? Is that possible? Is that something, or are there still prejudices at that level that exist?
I think we're in a state of flux right now. It's changing. I think there's a lot more interest and a lot more of a spotlight. People are disposing of their preconceptions of Africa, as we've seen amazing groundbreaking technologies like M-Pesa, for example, in Kenya, completely flip the banking model on its head. That is now rolling out in other developed countries and first world countries around the world, which is an incredible case study. In terms of creative products, we certainly hope so. We've got a piece we worked on for Conservation International that is going to be premiering at Tribeca Film Festival in a few weeks from now, which is a massive achievement, I think, for a South African company in a way, because that is a global stage as far as filmmaking goes. So hopefully we can be part of more of that sort of thing.
Donc le sud va à l'assaut du nord.
So south is now going up to north to attack.
Hopefully, we hope so. Yeah, we'll do what we can.
Et l'Afrique n'a jamais été aussi à la mode.
Africa has never been as fashionable as it is now. Everybody wants Africa. Everybody's looking towards Africa. There's this idea of traveling. There's a diaspora. There's all this youth which is appearing. Everybody wants to know what's happening in Africa. They want to know that Africa, and it's we're far removed from the prejudices of our parents, of our grandparents. It's another Africa which is emerging now. And as we've seen recently, just now, the startups are there, the conditions are in place. So today there's a technological leap, and we're just at the start of that leap. And we're far removed from what the situation was just 20 years back. Well, even if we see the success of different platforms, we talk about Hollywood productions now. In the future, they're going to be TV channels in the same way that they show the European cinema. The American TV films, African films are still struggling to be seen outside Africa, even within Africa. Today, can we see maybe will French TV channels open up to African productions? Well, we've been trying to do that. We've been doing that for 25 years and ever more so. Well, more than ever, as I was saying, Africa is in fashion. There's a trend there. There's a real demand. So why not? African cinema is exploding. There are African stars throughout the world. The borders are vanishing, and I think it's just the beginning. There's just the premises, and it's there are the African influencers that exist. They're working to relay what we have to offer. There's a lot going, and I think there's a level of creativity in Africa which is really emerging, exploding indeed. And absolutely, this is just the beginning, and that I'm sure that African production is exploding and appearing everywhere. From in particular, Côte d'Ivoire is one good example.
We come back to two figures that you mentioned. You talked about connectivity in Africa, which is weaker compared to other countries, other regions. It's important to know the MOOCs in the world, 20% of the users are Africans. Even with this low level of connectivity, we're still the biggest MOOC consumers, which shows there's a huge demand for that, as you were saying. So it's not going to stop. In May or June, for those who can come, there are universities in Spain, i.e. in Spain, or US universities. Their main market they're looking at is Africa. That's the first figure. The second figure was the Black Panther film. It broke all the records in a context where there were very few film theaters in Africa. Imagine if we had a distribution network like you have in Europe. Star Wars would have been peanuts. No, but we would have doubled, tripled any of the figures you can come up with. So the theaters in Nairobi, people are still queuing up. As I speak, it keeps going. It's some of the subjects we look at Acrobat. We have a marketplace study. We try and have these discussions. And we tell them, finding the means to distribute super productions in Africa beyond traditional cinemas, to rethink the model, rethink the ticket price, talking to operators, discussing with everyone. If you create that offer, if you crack that in Africa and the emerging countries, it's 80% of the less than 30-year-olds in the world. And that's where the potential is. But it's true, to stay with Black Panther, the success of Black Panther also reveals in Africa of a trend. We affirm increasingly the need for products that are inspired by African mythology, by African culture, real African characters. So that's because there's a real local demand. M-Pesa, a great figure here, is 24 million users. It's like connectivity. This is in very few years a huge increase. It's 50% of Kenya's population, and it's the equivalent of transactions of 23 billion euros, 44% of GDP of Kenya. Why did it work? Because it responded to a problem, because people had problems accessing banks. M-Pesa completely democratized banking. I'd like to, the room here, who's ever paid with mobile money in this room? Just one person. In Kenya, you pay everything with that. In Somalia, you don't have cash anymore. There's no cash. It's obsolete. Here we're still writing checks in this country. If you buy a train ticket from Nairobi to Mombasa, you must pay via M-Pesa. Transactions are secured and practical, and it's working. So thank you, Ammin, for telling us that. We're going to give the room some question time now. The first question is always the hardest. So, do you come from Kenya?
I'm sure you have a question for us. Right. For them. Oh, perhaps a point of view.
I do. I have to agree with some of the points that were brought up about, the question of, is it possible for Africa to do these productions that can be consumed internationally? And I was going to point out, the way that Black Panther is still continuing to take over and to break different expectations. I agree that there has to be better infrastructure to allow that to happen, but at the same time, I think the locus is also on the European market to change their perspective on how they view content that is made in Africa, and their perspective on Africa in general, especially in the West, not just Europe, but like the US. So I think a lot of things are already being made which are very creative and have been made for decades on the continent, whether it's in film or culturally in different spaces, but the consumption is limited culturally, like worldwide, because culture is seen as one-directional. So Western culture is always coming in, but African culture is not coming out. So that's one of the main things that has been, if Picasso, I think I just have to say Picasso, and that will be an explanation for this idea that I have. Like, he has profited forever, for decades, from aesthetics that are African, while African artists have not. It's just simple. So when the perspective in Europe and in the West changes, then that will open up African markets to the world.
Et d'ailleurs, si je me permettais,
if I may add something to that, the big mistake of Western markets is you consider Africa as a charity case. It's not a charity case. It's a business opportunity. Clearly, I think you've got to change your way of thinking, otherwise you will miss out on huge opportunities. We're talking about Black Panther. Who could have predicted? I wasn't surprised. Personally, really, I wasn't surprised. I'd be, what? Successful. Fine. I was in Kenya not long ago at High Up, which is the biggest incubator in West Africa. And I met a young man there who created an audio headset, Bits by Grey, well, a nice headset, a nice headphone, and the entire design had been done in Kenya. It's still being made in China because they don't have the production infrastructure, but the idea is to bring back the production to Africa. But the headphone was amazing. And there's not only a question of content, but also African brands in fashion, whether we're talking about Nigeria or South Africa. We're seeing in what you're saying, you're talking about Picasso, we could have talked about Burberry, which used wax everywhere. And it's everywhere in the shop windows, but very little, beginning to change, but very few African creators are in the e-commerce world online. There's still a problem from that point of view.
Yeah, I think just to add to that as well, I think what we're talking about is being very careful about the expropriation of South African or African culture in general, where either potentially it's foreign production muscle, let's say like a Disney coming in and producing a Queen of Katwe movie. I mean, that's an awesome thing to happen to Africa. Black Panther dipping into the cultural cues, the fashion and the tribal customs and that kind of thing. Lending those things, I think, is and can be a good thing, and I'm happy to see more of it. I think, to your point as well, I think it's important that we try and ensure that we can deal with a world into the future where it's not just made about Africa, but made by Africa as well. I think that's an incredibly important part about this too, because it's not that we're shouting to be noticed and to have stories told by, about Africans by non-Africans. I think having, our stories told from the inside and our products made from the inside is critical to what it is we have to achieve.
Produire ses propres contenus. Est-ce que nous avons d'autres questions?
Are there any other questions? Comments? I really appreciated your comment on African television that could be broadcast elsewhere, because I'm wondering whether the change might not come where there would be digital production coming out of Africa and could be broadcast everywhere, because I think that these last few years there's been a lot of effort for consuming north-south or west-east in Africa through telecommunications, where people often have 2 or 3 mobile phones, because there are 3 operators. And I get the impression we went from Amija to another with FM, when we had shortwave, to other media forms. So for the time being, the African man or woman is more of a consumer than a producer of content. No, I think it's a trend that we've seen emerging That's what the stake is, the challenge is for the next few years, how Africa will produce digitally. And we are looking for web series for African creation made by Africans. What works in our broadcasting are the African series that are doing really well because they're African series made by Africans, and we really need content to reach this public. We need to think about it and do it with them, but purely digital production is going on. There are YouTubers, for example, that are making 100% digital content, VR tomorrow. It's a question of time. It will be a reality one day. We were talking about gaming before. You can't wait for Africans to be turned on by Dungeons and Dragons. What you have to do, you have to have, you can come up with a game with an African king and a princess and all that. Adapt that content to that target. It's marketing. You have something to sell, adapt it. In terms of the question here, will Africa export its content? Maybe. Maybe not. I don't know. I don't get the impression that Chinese content is emerging. Is the Chinese film industry working? No, they have a lot of Chinese in Tunisia. Chinese series are doing very well when they're translated into Arabic. The main preoccupation of Africans is to produce content for themselves. Then if, perchance, it goes beyond that, for example, Brazil or the States, that'll come later. But let's begin by produce content that's bought and consumed locally. Because of the population growth we have and this huge potential, and that we get advertisers coming in who want to sell soap and all the rest. So as soon as when they're consumers, we can buy advertising, we'll be able to produce. And the question of schools for digital production. There are schools beginning to teach people in Africa, in North Africa, in East Africa. People are learning to code in primary school. And this will obviously have an impact on creation and web production. And also, we saw that today. What's really interesting is that technologically, interesting thing, you're talking YouTubers. You can make really nice productions with your smartphone, which wasn't possible 15 years ago anywhere, in Europe included. Maybe people who might not have come out of specialist schools, but hey, I'm going to do something. I'm going to... The French guy who does stuff, what's his name? Anyways, I can't remember his name, but... I can't get... It'll come back. So we'll have a lot of creation done by people who simply will try something with their smartphone, edit it, cut it, send it to TV5 Monde, and say, hey, is this the potential for a series? We already see that we have often criticized Nollywood, saying that Nigerian cinema wasn't very creative, but the thing is that they are exporting all over Africa and to Latin America. So there is a trend already. Michel Caudry was the guy, he finally remembered his name. Good afternoon. You were saying that you want Westerners, Europeans, whatever, to be more interested in Africa in terms of business. Isn't there, what I hear you saying is you're talking about Africa, but what we hear through the various examples that Africa, with all the countries it has, have very different levels of development. So finally, presenting the African market makes me think a bit about the American market. The legislation is the same culture, whereas in Africa, there are real differences between countries, and in the end, we talk about Africa, but in the end, will be done country to country, really, because where you could say, I'm going to develop my business in the US, 300 million people, whatever. Yes, there's a big African population, a lot of young people, but with huge disparities in terms of wealth, culture, etc. Is it not also one of the hurdles, and not to present Africa as a whole? No, it's true. We have to remind ourselves that it's 54 pays, with different realities and disparities in each country, but Nigeria will be fourth or fifth most populated country. Ethiopia has 100 million people. I think Algeria is at 90 million in Ethiopia. Algeria is several tens of millions. Mali, Rwanda are very different. South Africa is very different. But overall, New York is not Minnesota. So what you could offer to New Yorkers isn't the same as what you'll offer in the Midwest. In the same way, I can't judge Europe saying Greece is bankrupt, so in Norway, I don't produce anything. You have to look at, you're right. He said tu instead of vous. So he used the informal, which is more, you have to look at Africa, like Haiti, like any other region, except for China, which is a continent country, which has a state that's very, very interventionist. It's a different case. Just to add to what Ammin is saying, 54 states, 5 integrated regions. For an investor who wants to go to Ivory Coast, it's not just the Ivory Coast market, but it's the entire West African market. Same thing for East Africa. North Africa is different. So we can't talk about the 5 countries in North Africa, a different problem. But in Africa, you talk more about regions rather than individual countries. Does that answer your question? For the production of content, I see that there are success stories, but there are many different languages, different cultures. How do you explain that in the end, at a certain point, you manage to get some sort of consensus, whereas before, but there is a lot of disparity. So how do you account for that? In terms of content, therefore, how can you get millions of people interested, knowing that there aren't that many obvious common points? There are a few common points. We realize that the millennials in the world aren't the same, and they're not all involved in like the same thing, but there's a kind of YouTube culture. The common point is that there's a desire for music, commitment, the environment. We see a certain number of things. We have a program called Loudspeakers, which is a YouTube channel that uses videos developed by young French-speaking people who talk about subjects they're really have strong feelings about. They do it on their smartphones, and we publish it on our channel. And then we have a magazine that deals with that. Young Africans, Canadians, Belgians, Swiss kids who talk about, I don't know, the future of the planet, employment, refugees. They're citizens of the world. They have common preoccupations. The fact that they belong to the same generation, that they live on the same planet, is important. Global warming, for example. Equality between men and women is another subject. Employment, the future, insecurity. So, language is the common thread. because it's a culture, it's a certain number of values. We use this umbilical cord, if you like. From our point of view, there are that borders don't mean everything. The internet allows you to have access to other people's culture and to open the doors. A lot of young people listen to the same music today in the whole world. And let me, for music, for example, in Kenya, there's a heavy metal fan base, which is pretty big. Yeah. So there's a real big scene for heavy metal. So it's interesting because what you're saying is that things circulate. And when we look, Afropunk, which is a huge festival in the States, and did a first edition in South Africa not long ago, was a huge success.
Ulrico, dans le monde virtuel, est-ce que
So
la diversité
in
culturelle, est-ce que c'est
Ulrico, is a language a barrier?
I mean, in South Africa, it can be. It just kind of depends. You know, it's a diaspora of 11 official languages in South Africa. That's just the official, division, and that's a mix of tribal languages and languages that have come from Europe and become South African languages in the form of Afrikaans. If you look at our state TV broadcasters, you've got news that's broadcast in the 3 or 4 most predominant languages, but more and more so people are speaking English, and English is becoming a more common language in not just South Africa, but I would say Southern Africa, between Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, South Africa. And so, yeah, it's becoming a little bit easier with the language barriers.
Il va falloir qu'on rende la salle, je suis désolée.
So we're going to have to, unfortunately, stop. Thank you so much.